I wasn't looking for anything the night she said it, and that's probably why the words hit me so hard. It was late, the kind of quiet hour where the hallway lights flicker like they're tired too. And I was standing outside my apartment struggling with grocery bags that had no business being that heavy. That's when I heard her door open. Slowly, deliberately, like she knew timing mattered. She leaned against the frame, barefoot, wrapped in a loose sweater that looked like comfort and confidence had shaken hands. We'd exchanged polite hellos before, nothing more than nods, borrowed mail, the occasional shared elevator ride. But that night, she looked at me differently. Not curious, not shy, assessing. Then she smiled, tilted her head, and said almost casually, "You seem like you'd be good in bed. Are you married?" Time didn't freeze in movies the way it did in that hallway. My thoughts collided. Shock, amusement, suspicion, intrigue, all at once. I laughed because silence would have betrayed me, then said the only honest thing that came to mind. "No, I'm still waiting." Her smile changed. It wasn't playful anymore. It was interested. That was the moment everything shifted, because instead of walking away, she stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume. Subtle, intentional. She didn't apologize. She didn't laugh it off. She just said, "Waiting for what?" And I realized I hadn't been waiting for someone. I'd been waiting for a moment that felt real, that felt like risk, that felt like this. We talked that night about life, loneliness, choices we pretend not to regret. She told me she'd learned to ask bold questions because time had taken enough from her already. I told her I'd learned silence could be just as loud as rejection. When we finally went our separate ways, nothing had happened, but everything had changed. And as I lay awake in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, I knew one thing for certain. Neighbors weren't supposed to make your heart race like that. And tomorrow would not be normal. If you're feeling this tension already, make sure you subscribe, because this story is just getting started, and you don't want to miss what happens next. The next morning, I told myself it was nothing, just words, just confidence colliding with boredom. But when I opened my door and found a small note taped to it, handwritten, neat, intentional, I knew denial wasn't going to save me. Coffee tonight. No pressure. Apartment 3B. No name. No emoji. Just an invitation that respected choice while daring me to refuse. All day, I replayed the hallway moment in my head, wondering if I'd imagined the intensity, the way her eyes held mine a second too long. When evening came, I stood outside her door longer than I'd admit to anyone. When it opened, she looked different, calmer, softer, but no less confident. We sat across from each other, coffee untouched, conversation flowing like two people who had already crossed an invisible line. She told me about a marriage that had taught her what absence felt like even when someone was present. I told her about waiting not for perfection, but for honesty, the kind that doesn't hide behind politeness. At one point, she smiled and said, "Most people misunderstand that question I asked you." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I wasn't asking about skill. I was asking about presence." That landed harder than anything else she'd said. The night ended without promises, without labels, just understanding. As I left, she said, "Waiting doesn't mean doing nothing. Sometimes it means choosing carefully." Walking back to my apartment, I realized this wasn't a story about attraction. It was about timing, about courage, about two people brave enough to speak truths most people bury. And as I closed my door, I knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about connection. After that night, something invisible settled between us, like an unspoken agreement that neither of us would pretend this was casual again. Days passed where we didn't knock on each other's doors, didn't text, didn't invent reasons to cross paths. Yet somehow, every shared space felt charged, like the building itself had picked a side. I started noticing the smallest things. The way her footsteps sounded different in the hallway, slower when she passed my door, as if she wondered whether I'd open it. The way I found myself lingering by the window in the evenings, not waiting for her exactly, but not waiting either. When we finally met again, it was accidental, or at least that's what we told ourselves. The elevator stalled between floors, lights humming softly, trapping us in a space too small for distance, but too quiet for pretending. She laughed first, not nervously, but knowingly, and said it was funny how patience always gets tested right when you start believing you have some. I told her maybe that's how life checks if you're serious. The conversation turned deeper, faster than before. She admitted she was scared. Not of wanting something, but of wanting it with someone who hadn't already given up on hope. I admitted that waiting had become a habit, and habits can be hard to break even when the reason for them disappears. The elevator eventually jolted back to life, but neither of us moved right away. That pause, those few seconds, felt louder than the night she first spoke to me. When the doors opened, she touched my arm, not to stop me, not to pull me closer, just to acknowledge what was there. Sometimes, she said quietly, waiting ends without you realizing it. I watched her walk away, heart racing, understanding something crucial for the first time. This wasn't about desire anymore. It was about choice. And whatever came next would require courage from both of us. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived the way real change always does. Quietly, patiently, almost politely, until it was suddenly everywhere. After the elevator moment, we stopped pretending coincidence was the reason we kept running into each other. Morning walks overlapped. Grocery runs synced. Conversations that were once casual stretched longer, deeper, turning into reflections neither of us had planned to share. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows and the hallway lights dimmed into a kind of intimacy they'd never held before, she knocked on my door without hesitation, without apology. This time, there was no coffee, no small talk buffer. She sat on the couch like someone who had already decided to stay a while, and for the first time since we met, she looked vulnerable, not weak, but open in a way that takes more strength than confidence ever does. She told me the story she'd never told the neighbors, never told friends who preferred jokes over truth. She spoke about loving someone who had slowly stopped choosing her, about learning how loneliness can exist even in shared spaces, about how boldness became her shield because softness had once cost her too much. I listened, not to respond, not to impress, but because every word felt earned. When it was my turn, I admitted something I hadn't said out loud before. That waiting had been easier than risking disappointment again. That hope can feel dangerous when you've learned how fast it can collapse. The air between us grew heavy, not with tension, but with recognition. At one point, she stood and walked to the window, staring out into the rain, and said quietly that she wasn't looking for promises anymore. Just presence, honesty, and someone who wouldn't disappear when things became real. That was when I understood what her question in the hallway had truly meant all along. It had never been about attraction. It had been about courage. I stepped closer, not touching, not crossing lines, but close enough that she knew she wasn't alone in that moment. When she turned around, there were tears in her eyes she didn't bother hiding, and I realized this chapter of our lives wasn't about whether something would happen between us. It was about whether we were brave enough to stop waiting for the right time and start choosing each other deliberately. That night ended without drama, without declarations, but as she left and paused at the door, she smiled softly and said, "Waiting only works when you know what you're waiting for." And when the door closed behind her, I knew the truth I could no longer ignore. I wasn't waiting anymore. I was deciding. If this chapter made you pause, reflect, or feel seen, subscribe to the channel. The next chapter doesn't just continue the story, it reveals the choice that changes everything. The days that followed weren't dramatic, and that was how I knew they mattered. There were no sudden confessions shouted across hallways, no impulsive decisions made in the heat of a moment. Instead, there was intention. Mornings where we walked together without needing an excuse, evenings where silence felt comfortable instead of heavy, and conversations that no longer circled around fear but moved straight through it. One night, we sat on the building's rooftop, the city stretching endlessly around us, lights flickering like reminders of how many lives were unfolding at the same time as ours. She told me she had spent years believing strength meant never asking for anything, never needing anyone. I told her I had spent just as long mistaking patience for safety, thinking waiting would protect me from loss. Somewhere between those confessions, the distance between us disappeared. Not in a single dramatic step, but in a quiet understanding that neither of us wanted to go back to who we were before this connection existed. She asked me if I was still waiting, and for the first time, the answer came without hesitation. I told her I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for perfect timing, not for guarantees, not for fear to disappear. I was choosing presence over protection. She smiled then, not the confident smile from the hallway, not the guarded one from before, but something softer and real. And she said that choosing someone is braver than wanting them. As the night deepened, we sat shoulder to shoulder, not rushing what had taken time to build, letting the moment be enough. When we finally stood to leave, she reached for my hand, not to pull me forward, not to promise anything beyond honesty, but to confirm what we both already knew. This wasn't a story about a bold question or a clever reply anymore. It was about two people who stopped hiding behind waiting and started living with intention. And as we walked back downstairs together, I understood something that felt simple but profound. The right moment doesn't arrive. You create it when you decide to stop waiting.